Yeah, he's right. I am going to have to put on my best Gary Lacefield impression to get through all the slides that I've got in here, and I hope that you will buckle tight and cinch it up tight so we can get through this as quickly as we possibly can. And maybe if I free myself up from this lectern, I could be able to maybe go a little faster. I want to first start with, I'm going to cover a lot of data in a very short amount of time, and I've gone ahead and put all of this material online in a PDF form, so that if you want to, as we go through it, scan this QR code and you will go to that particular website that has that PDF, and you'll be able to really take a look at that data in more detail than what I'm going to be able to present it in. Okay, so I'll pause there for just a little bit, and while we're doing that, I'm going to make a few disclaimers. First of all, for all the students that are in the audience, if your hero, your mentor ever asks you to do something, you better make sure what's in the fine print. I've learned that there's really good advice, particularly in extension, is never to talk about religion or politics. I think we should probably add mob grazing to that list. Because in my career, I have 4 instances of hate mail that I have received. I won't go into the first 2 or 3, but the 4th one was, one of them actually involved a lawyer. Adam Spears in here somewhere, he got that same nastygram that I got. And I considered that a job well done that particular day, because it came from a company that was selling some snake oil, and we told them that's just what it was. But the 4th one was on some articles that I wrote, raising some questions about mob grazing. Now, I'll just say right out front, I have not conducted any of the research that I'm going to be showing today. I purposefully have shown everything other than my research. There's some in there that I will chip in and say is similar to what we're finding as well. But as we go along, if you have problems with their data, go take it up with them, all right? Now, the other thing I would say is that there is relatively little peer-reviewed research in the literature. There is some master's theses, there are some industry reports, but there are relatively few that have actually gone through and been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so for those of you that are scientists in the audience, just recognize that some of the material here is not perfect. Okay, in terms of having gone through that rigorous kind of review. Also, as I go through, I'm going to talk about these in kind of shorthand format. Anytime I use CONT, that's standing for Continuous Graze Systems. And if I'm talking about mob graze systems, I'm talking about a short duration grazing system with high or to ultra high stocking densities, basically anything greater than 100,000 pounds of body weight to the acre. And then I've put a little comma and a number there at the end. If I can get my pointer to point, it's not pointing over there. Maybe it'll point over here. Nope. But the pound there, the number then would be how long are they in that particular paddock in days. So for example, a mob, 0.33 is mob stocked at those stock densities that I'm talking about and moved 3 times a day. Okay. Same sort of thing for rotational grazing, or some folks like to call it rational grazing. That's actually my preferred term. But if we're looking at the number of days, then it also is going to have that number out to the end. So in this case, RG3 would be rotational stocked, moved every 3 days. Okay. Now, I want to highlight that really what I'm going to be talking about primarily is comparing mob grazing versus that more management-intensive grazing, rotational grazing format. I think most of us who are involved in grazing could accept on surface value that the scientists have pretty well proven that, from an efficiency standpoint, the more intensive grazing systems are going to be more able to utilize the forage out there. The efficiency is going to be much greater. So for most of what I'm going to be talking about is comparing those 2 systems, kind of the high end of management here. So I'm going to go through a series of questions. And we'll start out with some simple ones. Does mob grazing decrease the amount of walking that cattle must do? Presumably there'd be shorter distances to water. There might be some differences in forage intake rates, and therefore they may eat faster and go back and retreat. And so the research, if you look at some of the conclusions that have been drawn from some work that's been done in Nebraska, they put these little pedometers, just like our Fitbits, and in my case a Garmin, put it on those cattle, and we watched them track the numbers as they go around the pastures. And actually the mob grazed cattle in this particular case had 40% greater steps per day than the rotationally grazed systems. Now, that was slightly less if they were in square blocks rather than rectangular blocks, but it still was a substantial increase over the traditional rotational grazing. What about lowering forage quality? Well, some studies from both Nebraska and from Michigan State here. No treatment effects in the spring. There really wasn't much difference in forage quality during the spring of the year in either one of those two trials. But we did see in this particular case in both Nebraska and Michigan that the mob graze systems toward the later part of the season had lower crude protein. And I think that's fairly typical of what we probably would expect as the crop matures going through the summer. What was kind of interesting is that the cool season grass pastures, the mob systems actually did see a 10 to 15% lower digestibility there in Michigan in the latter part of the season. But there was no consistent differences in Nebraska. Okay, in Nebraska sandhill meadows, more of a cool season with some native warm season grasses there. They didn't see as much of a difference there in their study on in vitro digestibility. So does it affect low dry matter intake? Does it lower dry matter intake? Maybe because of that lower forage quality. Does it lower animal performance? So what can be said about what's in the research right now? Now this is the Michigan study, cool season grass species, very intensive grazing system here, the RG1, and then mob graze where they're moving it 3 times a day. Really no difference in body weight of those animals. No difference in the body weight, no real difference in the dry matter intake. Whether that was early in June or early in September, there really wasn't much difference there. It's kind of surprising if we look at the quality that was on offer, but actually it's kind of interesting that they didn't see any difference there. What about other systems? A more recent study in Arkansas, this is just getting underway, but in a warm season grass-based system, in what they called it a mob grazing system, but it's a little bit lower than the threshold that we said of 100,000 pounds of body weight to the acre. But those tended to lose more body condition than those on a rotational grazing system moved every 6 days. Now, in their system, they also looked at cow and calf body weight. No difference there, but even though there was a trend toward more loss of body condition, there was no difference in body weight, and there was no blood serum indicators of stress among those treatments. Now, if we look at this work from Nebraska over 5 years here, and but 4 of those, when they were looking at yearling steer performance here, all but 4 of those, the rotational grazing system moving every 10 days, and this actually was such that they would be coming back to those same paddocks twice per year, whereas the rotational graze 15, and this pointer is just not quite powerful enough to pick that up, but rotational graze 15 there was only once per year would they hit a particular spot. And so compared to the mob grazing though, we see greater animal performance here with the rotational grazing in 4 out of the 5 years, and probably a little bit of a tendency there, just numerical at that point though. So average day of the gain, greatest on the rotational grazing compared to the mob grazing. Does it cause shift in pasture composition? Does it increase or decrease the legume content? Does it increase or decrease the proportion of cool season grasses and warm season grasses to one another? Does it increase or decrease the weed pressure? Well, let's look at the study from Michigan. In both the grazing systems that they compared, they saw a loss of bluegrass. They also saw a tendency for a loss of the shorter grasses in the mob graze system. You've got differences in height, and with that mob graze system, long rest period, that's going to generally shift the balance toward those taller growing species. They also noted a decline of legume component in the mob graze system and an increase in the legume component in the rotational graze system. Now this is a very intensively managed rotational grazing system, kind of on the borderline really of being more of a mob graze system, moving once a day, very, very intensive though. Now that could be a consequence of it being a shorter legume species and why they lost it in the mob grazing system, but it also could be, maybe it was a difference in weather. And most of the time we're seeing trends here of it being more weather related than anything else. Similar reports in two different kinds of mob grazing systems here, once a day versus 4 times a day. In Iowa, they saw a similar kind of shift and no major changes there in species over the course of, in the case of the Nebraska study, it was over the course of 5 years. In the case of the Iowa study, it was just a year or 2, I think. Now, both the Michigan study and the Nebraska study here indicated only marginal changes in vegetation complexity and richness, and they postulated that most of those changes were actually weather-related. If you look at other literature that's in there about differences in stocking density and grazing intensity, although those were not at the high or ultra-high level, but all of them had concluded basically it was more of a weather effect than grazing intensity. It may just so happen to be that a heavy grazing event occurred relative to a change in the weather or drastic weather event. But in general, the findings from the literature would suggest that species change may have more to do with weather than grazing management. So, does mob grazing increase forage utilization? Does it increase or decrease the amount that is trampled? That's one of the ideals behind mob grazing. Does it increase or decrease the amount that is consumed by the livestock? So here is work from Nebraska, and where they had a mob grazing system again, and 2 different rotational grazing systems. And what you see in the green is disappearance, which presumably went into the mouth of the animal. And then you have that which is trampled. And I think the LSD here was a 17 percentage point swing there. So if it's not any greater than 17%, then they weren't statistically different. What you can see here is there's definitely a difference between a few of these in terms of disappearance, and a tendency for much more to be trampled in the mob grazing system. That's to be expected. Sometimes that's planned. But what we also see here is less actually going into the mouth of the animal. So these were similar to findings in the Michigan state work as well. Just in the interest of brevity, I skipped over theirs just to say ditto. Basically, they saw the same thing. Now, in that work in Nebraska, they saw that approximately 60% of the green tillers were actually trampled. 60% of the green tillers, not the brown tillers, not those that have already senesced, but the green tillers, those that are actively growing. Now, what they defined as trampled was anything bent at an angle that was 45 degrees or greater. But their work actually showed was that if it was greater than that 45-degree angle being bent over, it was unlikely to recover from that injury. They also went a step further and they increased the stock density above 100,000 pounds of body weight to the acre, all the way up to, I think it was 500,000 pounds of body weight in increments. They saw no increase or decrease in the amount that's trampled versus disappearance. Okay? It basically stayed the same, as did total utilization. So anything above 100,000 didn't seem to make any difference there in terms of what percent was trampled or disappeared. What about soil compaction? This is a question I oftentimes get from our NRCS colleagues. What about changes in soil compaction? Did it affect penetrometer resistance? Did it affect bulk density? And when I say penetrometer resistance, some of you may have seen one of these tools before. I use it kind of frequently. It's actually a penetrometer, it's a rod that you stick into the ground. It has a strain gauge on it to tell us how hard that resistance is. And if you use it when the field is at field capacity, when its soils are good and wet, like today, you could get a good indication of what kind of resistance are in that soil. And you want this to be less than 300 psi, less than about 2,000 kilopascals. So if we look at some work that was done in Iowa, what they found was no difference in the soil penetrometer readings in 2 different styles of mob grazing in the spring. Now they subsequently rotationally grazed on part of that and not on others, and where they subsequently rotationally grazed through the summer months in 1 year, mind you this was 2013 I think, they ended up with some additional compaction there. Again, that may have been weather related because it was only 1 year that they reported upon that. In a follow-up trial where they compared rotational grazing, two different styles of rotational grazing, an RG1 and an RG3, 3 days versus 1, and continuous stocking of those pastures, the RG1 tended to have lower penetration resistance. In other words, it was less compacted. Okay? Now, moving on to the study in Michigan, what they found was in their bulk densities, and they looked at different soil increments here, 0 to 2 inches, 2 to 4 inches, 4 to 8, and 8 to 12. And even though there wasn't an overall treatment effect, what they really looked at was if we compare within those treatments, they did see a tendency at least for there to be lower bulk density, less compaction in the rotationally grazed once a day option versus the mob grazing moving 3 times a day. In the shallow, in the 2 to 4, and then once it got down below about 4 to 8 and 8 to 12, there really wasn't much difference beyond that. Okay. Uh-oh. There we go. So there was a tendency for soil compaction to be higher for the mob grazing in 2013, but not in 2012. In the first year of the study, they didn't see much difference. Now, mind you, 2012, many of you recall from the Midwest, was a very dry year. Okay? But in 2013, they did start seeing some differences in soil compaction. What about increasing or decreasing the litter on the soil surface? Does it increase or decrease the mulch effect? Is it mulching more into the soil? This is the Nebraska work. This is really the only one of the studies that looked at how much litter was going into the soil. And what you can see here is the rotationally grazed system actually showed the largest increase, and the mob grazing system actually decreased numerically, really was no different than the ungrazed control. Further, they looked at, despite it having the most trampling, the litter percentage and the litter mass was lowest on the mob grazing treatment. And they also found that there was no differences in litter mass in 2012 and 2013 or in 2014 and 2015 between any of the grazing treatments. Okay? There really wasn't any difference there beyond those first few years. Furthermore, they showed that there was no increase in root production or litter decomposition rate with the mob grazing system compared to the other grazing systems. That's presumably one of the benefits of this more intensive system. But if you compare it to these other rotational grazing systems, they didn't see any added benefit of going to the mob grazing system. So let's look at the soil now. Does that alter the soil environment? Does it increase or decrease the soil temperature or the soil moisture? All right, so here are some data from Michigan and the mob grazing. If we look at the temperatures there, and I apologize, my pointer is no longer working, but you can see that at pretty much every instance in time, the mob grazing soil temperature was greater than the rotational grazed system. So we can conclude there based on 3 years and 2 different time periods within those 3 years that in their situation, soil temperatures at a 2-inch depth were the least actually for the rotational grazed system compared to the mob grazed system. What about soil moisture? That's really pertinent, right? We want to make sure we've got plenty of soil moisture. And with the exception of a really moist spring in 2013, pretty much everywhere along the board there, the rotationally grazing paddocks generally had greater soil moisture. They were holding more moisture than the mob grazed systems. Does mob grazing actually increase soil organic matter? Carbon in the soil. That's very pertinent relative to the previous speaker's presentation there earlier. Does it increase soil carbon? Does it increase or decrease soil nitrogen? Well, if we look at, and I'm going to go ahead and put all of the lettering up here. If we look at those different soil depth increments that they measured there in Michigan, at each of those, there was a statistical improvement in soil organic matter for the rotational grazed system, but the mob grazing system was not different than the non-grazed or ungrazed control. So the key finding there is perhaps that rotational grazing is actually resulting in more carbon and soil organic matter than the others. If we look at total soil carbon, total soil nitrogen, the story is very similar. The rotational grazing system ended up with more soil carbon, soil nitrogen, and the mob graze system was actually not significantly greater than the non-grazed grassland. Now, as I go forward here, I just want to do a real quick caution and say this is an academic exercise for going forward here. This is a extrapolation of the data and really probably beyond the limits. But let's just look at where that non-graze system is versus the rotational graze system. That was a difference of 9.4 tons of carbon to the acre. Over the course of 3 years, that's an average increase in carbon of 3.1 tons of carbon to the acre. Now, those of you that are good forage agronomists or agronomists in general are starting to shake your heads and saying, that's a bunch of B something, right? That's not possible. I used to think that's not possible as well until we started collecting some data on our pasture-based dairies, and our rate is about 3.6 tons of carbon to the acre. It's incredible the amount of carbon that can be added to those soils. And a lot of it, I think a lot of this idea about mob grazing in general is kind of getting this soil carbon thing confused, because the historical, what most of us were taught when we were in school, is that most of the carbon that's added to that soil is coming from the leaf litter. But as it's turned out, the science has shown that that's really not true. That if we start really looking at that soil profile, there's a strong relationship between where the carbon is and where the roots are at. It's the roots that's really what's doing that. And if you look at root production, over a 25-year study, this was in China, 25 years of measuring this and looking at different time points, the amount of root production explained most of that variation. Over 80% of that variation is explained by root production. It's the roots that's doing the work. And if we really look at how much is going back in there, a study in 2005 showed that the relative contribution of the below ground material to the above ground material is about 1.5 to 3.7 to 1. In other words, roots and root exudates contribute about 60 to 80% of all of soil organic matter. It's not necessarily the litter on top. In fact, if you really take a close look at that soil and you see that soil, that root, and unfortunately you can't see this, so I'm going to just kind of walk over to it. Right in the center of this is a root, and the little web-like material that you see coming off of that root is actually fungal mycelia. It's the mycelia that are really working in conjunction with that root that's really adding a lot of carbon to that soil. It's the root and the root exudates contributing 60 to 80%. So we really want to improve roots. Now, let's go on to this question about our carbon footprint. What effect is this having on carbon emissions from the pasture? What animal effect is occurring here? Is it just from the pasture, but then also from the animal itself? So let's dive into that. And the guys at Michigan State did a great job with this. They really looked at this in detail. And they measured both the pasture and then also from the animal. And from the pasture alone, there was slightly more carbon dioxide coming off of that rotationally grazed area. Now that stands to reason because there's actually more organic matter there, and presumably there's more soil health there. There are more microorganisms that play there. When they looked at nitrous oxide emissions, no difference. When they looked at methane emissions from just the pasture now, no difference. Okay? When they looked at methane emissions from the animals, though, they did see a greater amount of emissions from the rotationally grazed pastures, more than twice. Now, we'll come back to that point in just a minute, but when you total all those emissions up on a per unit area, on a given acre of land, a given hectare of land, there was no difference between the two statistically. But you got to keep in mind, in this study, there was a difference in stocking rate. In this study, the rotational grazing system actually was able to carry more animals to the acre. So their effective stocking rate was roughly 2.2 what the mob graze system was. So when you correct for the stocking rate and put this on an animal unit basis, the rotational grazing system actually resulted in 60% less greenhouse gas emissions in total. Okay? Roughly the same in terms of animal emissions, but in total, there was less coming out per animal unit there on the rotationally grazed system. So let's look at the overall carbon footprint of some of these different systems. Some previous research out of Iowa looked at feedlots, backgrounding and then putting them in a feedlot, and then grass-fed, and carrying those animals from cradle to finish on a grass-based diet. And they concluded, using their models, that this was roughly the amount of megagrams of carbon per steer that was coming out. And the high being here the backgrounded and feedlot. Now, Jason Roundtree from Michigan State took their work from those 3 trials there that were published in Journal of Animal Science and looked at that and extrapolated that for finishing animals there. And that's what's in the middle column there, 3.3 for the mob graze system and 2.8 for the rotationally grazed systems. And if they applied that using the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, without any of their own data in that, they still got some relatively high numbers. But if they used their own data there, they could show that it was substantially reduced. Now, I want to point out, though, that this data does not account for carbon sequestration in the soil. And remember I said earlier, if we take a leap here and say that it was 3.1 megagrams, or excuse me, 3.1 tons to the acre, we quickly would see that these are going to offset, actually, and that these systems are actually carbon neutral, or approaching carbon neutral at least. So, bottom line, though, is, does mob grazing make more money? Is it less variable from year to year? If we look at the average returns, this was some work that was published from South Dakota State University. This is their average return based on the work that was done in Nebraska and other places as well. But what they showed here is that the best one was actually the rotational graze system. So is it more variable from year to year, though? Actually, the mob graze system was the most variable from year to year. The rotational grazing was the least variable from year to year. The probability of a return greater than $25 to the acre most likely is going to come from the rotational grazing system. So, just in summary, does it increase the amount that the cattle walk? Yes, it actually does increase it by about 40%. Does tend to have a negative effect to some degree on forage quality, but not always. That's kind of a mixed bag. Dry matter results, not kind of strong tendency one way or the other, kind of mixed. But if we're maintaining brood stock, maintaining animals, pretty much that's going to work just fine. But if we're starting to put weight onto these animals or trying to put weight gain on these animals, it doesn't seem to work quite as well. Does it cause any pasture composition shifts? Decreases the legume content, shifts from shorter species, usually the cool season grasses, to taller grass species, and then not enough data really to conclude about weed pressure just yet. Most of the species that were observed to shift really seem to be more weather related in their shift than anything else. Does it increase forage utilization? It increases the amount that is trampled, decreases the actual amount that is consumed. Changing in soil compaction, the results are mixed on that one. Sometimes yes, sometimes more, probably more weather related than anything else in the timing of that grazing. Does it increase the litter on the soil surface? It actually seems to decrease the litter on the soil surface. Does it affect the soil environment? Actually increases the soil temperature, increases or decreases the soil moisture. Does it increase soil organic matter? It doesn't increase soil organic matter like the rotational grazing system, and there's a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio in the rotational grazing, or excuse me, in the mob grazing than in the rotational grazing system. Does it decrease the carbon footprint? Greenhouse gas emissions per unit area are approximately the same. The studies to date have not really increased the stocking rate, though, to kind of